Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Katie Peace, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. And we're very happy to have you here for today's author talk with Kelly Hayes McAlonie. And I do want to thank our sponsors, the Peggy Ann and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust, who underwrite all of our Preservation Book Club programming. If you've made your way to our webinar but are not familiar with the League, allow me to introduce you. The Preservation League of New York State empowers all New Yorkers to use historic preservation to enrich their communities, protect their heritage, and build a sustainable future. The League does this work in every corner of New York State in many different ways, including providing grants that jumpstart preservation projects. We advocate for preservation at the local, state, and national level. We provide technical assistance, collaborate with local colleagues across the state. We award excellence in historic preservation, and we're currently looking for nominations for that program right now. Head to our website. We draw attention to at-risk historic sites through our 7 to Save program, and we offer lots of virtual programs like the one that you are joining us for today. And so, what we are here today to talk about is this newly released book, Louise Blanchard Bethune, Every Woman Her Own Architect. This is a comprehensive biography of the first professional woman architect in the United States, who was also the first woman to be admitted to the American Institute of Architects. This book serves as an important addition to New York and architectural history, which is exactly why we wanted to invite its author to come talk to us today. So Kelly Hayes McAlonie, she is the Director of Campus Planning at the University at Buffalo. Her work involves overseeing the implementation of the university's comprehensive master plan and the strategic planning for UB's 3 campus environments. She is a member of the Association of University Architects, and in 2011, she and her colleague collaborated with Mattel on the design and launch of Barbie, I Can Be Architect. Pretty cool. Kelly has also been very active in the American Institute of Architects, serving as the 2008 president of AIA Buffalo, Western New York, 2012 president of AIA New York State, and the 2016 to 19 regional representative of the AIA National Strategic Council. She recently served a 3-year term on the National Architectural Accrediting Board as treasurer. She also serves on the steering committee for the Trailblazing Women of Western New York, an initiative of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women to place monuments to women in our public realm. Following Kelly's presentation today, she's going to be joined in conversation by her colleague Roxanne Button. Roxanne is an architect and sustainability consultant working in her own practice, Design Synergies Architecture in Buffalo, New York. Her work is infused with a commitment to integrated project design and multidisciplinary collaboration, working on a variety of projects in both new and historic buildings. The thread that ties together her 3 decades of diverse experience is a constant focus on the interconnections between architectural and interior design, materials and occupant health, and building envelope and energy conservation. Roxanne is a longtime volunteer with AIA, the U.S. Green Building Council, and the Construction Specifications Institute, where she has advocated for continuing education and knowledge sharing across disciplines. Roxanne founded the Committee on the Environment for AIA Buffalo, Western New York, and she currently serves on the board of directors as their president-elect. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to Roxanne to give us an introduction to today's presentation, and then she'll kick it over to Kelly.
Thank you so much, Katie. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Preservation Book Club and our presentation by Kelly Hayes McAlonie on the work and life of Louise Blanchard Bethune. I thought that I would try and set the context for the era in which Louise worked and practiced in Buffalo, and it was a very prosperous time in this city. What set Buffalo on the path to become one of the wealthiest and busiest cities in the country of that era was the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 and the opening up of the Midwest through Buffalo. So there was a lot of traffic through and into this city, a lot of money through and into this city, and that really set the stage for the city that Buffalo became. And it was in this city that architects like Louis Sullivan, H.H. Richardson, Daniel Burnham, Frank Lloyd Wright were all building here, and all around the time that Louise lived and practiced here. By 1901, Buffalo was the 8th largest city in the United States and had over 60 millionaires. So it gives you some idea of the types of buildings that were being built here, the quality of the architecture, and the immense importance of the city as an architectural, for its architectural landmarks. So in the era when Louise was living and practicing in the city, it was really a remarkable time, and there was so much going on. It's hard to imagine seeing all these buildings going up around you, and looking at it from our perspective now today and seeing these masterpieces of architecture. It certainly was remarkable to be an architect here at that time, and to be a woman in architecture at that time. Kelly Hayes McAlonie has captured that era in the story of this trailblazing architect, the first professional woman architect in the United States, Louise Blanchard Bethune. And it's a wonderful story, and has so many interesting nuances to it. And it's such a great time period in this city. But Louise's story has never been truly told. So I am really happy to welcome our presenter today, Kelly Hayes McAlonie.
Thank you, Roxanne, and thank you, Katie, and the Preservation League of New York State for inviting me. What an honor it is to speak with you all. I'm going to begin this presentation with an excerpt from my book, as we just talked about, my book that came out in March 2023. It was June 1876 in Buffalo, New York. Richard Waite, the most prominent architect in the city, was very busy. The construction of the Pierce Palace Hotel was about to begin, and there were other significant projects on the boards in his office. Waite's exciting new projects promised to elevate his firm's reputation beyond the confines of Western New York. Summer is warm and pleasant in Buffalo, a welcome respite from the long and snow-filled days of wintertime for the Queen City of the Great Lakes. During one of these warm and busy days, 19-year-old Louise Blanchard entered Waite's office in the German Insurance Building at Lafayette Square, looking for employment. This was most unusual because no woman architect practiced in the United States at this time, or anywhere else for that matter. Architects were expected to do more than just draw plans for a building. They had to oversee construction, negotiate rates, maintain budgets, to manage the entire process that goes into successfully completing a project. Women just didn't seem to have the required capabilities to be successful architects. For starters, they were thought to lack the physical stamina to work on construction sites. Why, even their clothing, which included tight corsets and long skirts with bustles, precluded this kind of work. The idea of a woman performing the many duties of an architect was hardly thinkable. Blanchard told Waite that she had wanted to be an architect since childhood. She said her friends mocked her in grade school, but she persevered in her ambition to pursue her dream. She graduated from Buffalo High School in 1874 and continued in its 2-year college preparatory program with the intention of attending Cornell University's newly opened architecture department. She took advanced courses, tutored other students, and traveled in preparation for her continued studies. She hoped Waite would hire her for the summer until her program began. And despite the common prejudice against women working in the profession, Waite hired her in June of 1876, enabling Louise to fulfill her dream and become an architect. So as Roxanne gave that really wonderful presentation on the context in which Louise lived and provide the backdrop to this work, sadly, after Louise died in 1913, even though she had been a famous woman architect in the United States, certainly in Buffalo, she was an unknown figure shortly after her death. By the 1920s, she was long forgotten, even in Buffalo. And it wasn't until the 1980s that she was rediscovered. But this paragraph here, that she mostly wrote this for a Woman of the Century from 1893, this was what we knew about Louise from pretty much her passing until the 1980s and onwards. And it states that Jenny Louise Blanchard Bethune was born in 1856 in Waterloo, New York, and raised in Buffalo. She moved to Buffalo at age 11. Instead of attending Cornell, she worked for Richard Waite and opened her architectural office in 1881, for the first woman to do so. She married fellow architect Robert, also in 1881, and he became her business partner. They had one child, Charles. Louise was admitted in the WAA, the Western Association of Architects, in 1885, and the American Institute of Architects in 1888. She designed houses, factories, schools, and the Lafayette Hotel. She refused to compete for the Columbia Women's Exposition, women's building design, and she died in 1913. So up until fairly recently, this is pretty much all we know. There have been actually a couple of books written on Bethune with very little more information than this. But I was very fortunate after I moved to Buffalo to become friendly with a number of women and men who had close connections with Bethune, and I was through that I was enabled to identify ephemera and photographs that provided a brand new context to Louise. So this photo on the upper left that you see, this was the only known photo that we'd had of Louise, and this was from the A Woman of the Century book that was published in 1893. And that image was the only known photo that we had until 2010. And another photo was identified. But when I came to, in the 1980s, 1981, the woman in the middle, Adriana Barbash, was a Buffalo-based architect who was contacted by the American Institute of Architects asking her to research Louise's life and career. This was in the aftermath of the second wave of feminism, when the AIA was starting to think about recognizing some of its women founders. And so Adriana started this work and did some of the early publishing of her work. She did a lot of work in identifying a number of her buildings, and whatever little information that people drew upon up until my book was obtained through Adriana's work. I moved to Buffalo in 1998, and I met Adriana in 2002. And she was retiring at that time, and I was very active in the AIA. And so when she decided to retire, she asked me if I would be interested in receiving her 20 years at that point worth of research on Louise, which I was very happy to do so. And the first thing I did was nominate Louise successfully to the Western New York Women's Hall of Fame. And it was through that effort that I met the woman to the upper right, Nancy Hurlin Brady, who is the great-granddaughter of Louise and Robert's third partner, Will Fuchs. The partnership was Bethune, and Fuchs. And so Nancy lives in Grand Island, and is the great-granddaughter of Will Fuchs. So she was the one who found in her family heirlooms a photo of Bethune and Fuchs that had a frontal shot of Louise. We were able to finally have a photo of her from the front, standing next to her business partners. At that same time, I met the woman in the lower left, Zena Bethune, who was the sole heir and great-granddaughter of Robert and Louise. She was an actor and an artist living in LA, but she had grown up in New York. She and I became very close friends, and from about 2004 to about 2012, we remained in touch quite often. And sadly, in 2012, Zena passed away. She was killed in a car accident. And shortly after that, I became friends with her husband, who is in the middle picture at the bottom, Sean Feely. And when Sean was going through Zena's materials, he found this cache of photo albums that Zena, I think, had long forgotten about, that had photos of Louise. And it was those photos that he then donated to the University at Buffalo, Rare Special Collections, that is now part of the Zena Bethune collection on Louise Bethune. You can access these photos online. And in it, there were over 20 photos of Louise. and those form the basis of my book. So as you can tell, it has been a 20-year endeavor of mine to not only learn more about Louise, but understand her context and how it is that she became the first professional woman architect in the United States. This is the photo that Nancy Hurlin Brady found in her collection. And you can see, of course, Louise standing in the middle. Next to her, on the right, to her left, is Robert Bob Bethune, her husband. And the man on his left, our right, far right, is Will Fuchs. The gentleman beside Louise was an intern. We don't know his name. So these are more photos that we have from Louise, from the collection from Zena, and I colorized these myself. So I took a little liberty, but again, it was in the spirit of trying to bring Louise to life and to provide color to her life. So Louise, as I mentioned earlier, was born in Waterloo, New York, to two educators. Her father and mother were both educators, and they moved around quite a bit. They were originally from Manlius, moved to Waterloo, had Louise, and then shortly thereafter moved to Forestville, New York, which is in Chautauqua County. And Louise was a sickly child as a little one, and she was homeschooled by her mother. And right around the age she was of 7, a number of things happened that were very traumatic to Louise. First of all, her father was conscripted into the Civil War. We don't know if he served, but he was conscripted. And then second, Edwin and Emma, her parents, Darwin and her mother, Emma, had 2 children, Clara and Edwin Blanchard. And within a year of their birth, Edwin passed away. He died before his 1st birthday. And then Clara passed away not long before her 5th birthday. So within the span of, from the age of about 7 to 11 years of age, Jenny Louise, who had been born as a sickly child, went from being very isolated from the rest of her extended family, moved around a lot. Her father may or may not have been home. She went from being an only child to being the eldest of 2, presumably sickly children. And then by the age of 11, was back to being an only child again. So she had a very close relationship with her parents. They were her strongest support, and that relationship endured throughout her entire life. In fact, she and Robert lived with her parents pretty much until her father passed away. Sorry. And so when Louise states from Woman of the Century that she had acquired the habits of study and self-reliance, which led her through school life to disregard the usual class criterions, one can imagine how her background fed into that, being homeschooled, being a daughter of 2 educators, and then living through this very traumatic childhood. She learned to be a strong person, an independent thinker on her own. But why Louise? We know why she had the right personality, obviously. And what was it about this particular person? What was the context that enabled her? So first of all, Roxanne mentioned location. Buffalo was a very rapidly growing city. It was a city whose business leaders had a strong interest in architecture and saw that architectural growth was part of demonstrating not only the prosperity of the city, but also of themselves. So they were very interested in the work in Chicago and in New York, and very much wanted to see Buffalo in that realm. She had a willing mentor, Richard Wade, as I mentioned, who was unafraid to hire her initially, and then was a hands-on mentor throughout her career. She had a very strong support system. Her parents, as I mentioned, were devoted, and they actually financially supported her. And then she had independent clients, so originally government, but then as her career progressed, they became more independent business leaders. So this is her mentor, Richard Waite, and this is Waite's mentor, John Kellum. In the book, I go into depth about Waite's background and Kellum's, but Kellum was one of the most important architects in New York in the Gilded Age, and he hired Waite in the 1860s and trained him in architecture. And it was a really important time in New York, as many of you are probably aware. I'm disappointed there aren't more books on architects and architecture from the era right after the Civil War in the 1860s. But during this era, when Waite was in New York, coming from Buffalo, New York was deeply in transition, where young women were flocking to the city. Either their parents, their father, their husband, their brothers, their beaux had been killed in the Civil War, or they just wanted excitement, but they flocked to this city, which was a growing industrial city. And many of them worked in these new department stores, or they worked in domestic service, or they worked in factories. One of Kellum's main clients was a man named Alexander Stewart, who was the first Mr. Selfridge of his day, the Stewart's department store. And so Stewart, knowing that women were in peril living in the city, if they weren't living in the right boarding house or even going to work, they could be compromised. He hired Kellum to design the first working women's hotel. Sadly, the project failed. Both Kellum and Stewart died right around the time that it opened, and it failed shortly after. But I think that this is partly why Waite was interested and willing to hire Louise, because he had seen women in New York during his time there, struggle for independence, and he wanted to help someone. And he had also been assisted as a young person by Kellum. This is a photo of Louise. I think it may have been her wedding photo, but I've been able to identify through various sources, various clubs and whatnot that she was part of, that she was a very athletic person, which is noteworthy because of the fact that she'd been a sickly child, but also, of course, during the Gilded Age, when women were not known to be terribly athletic, but she was the first woman in Buffalo to own her own bicycle, and she rode her bicycle around town to the office on construction site. And we have multiple newspaper articles where this is described. And Robert, who is standing again, I think this was their wedding photo. Robert, this is Louise in the red, and Robert into her back. He was another part of her staunch support system. Their marriage actually feels much more contemporary marriage that you might see now between two architects. Where Louise was and they were a perfect couple in many ways, where she was energetic, the leader, the natural leader. He was more empathetic. She was self-confident, ambitious, assertive. Robert was more artistic. He was very much involved in theater and was constantly put people's lives, in particular his wife's well-being, in front of his own. So she was the one who was quick, was funny, was witty, was a true leader, and he was the one who really was the closer in the relationship. And he repeatedly sacrificed his own career for Louise's. So Louise and Robert began their practice in 1881, as I mentioned, and by 1884, a group of Chicago architects, namely Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, and John Root, created the Western Association of Architects. This was in answer to the American Institute of Architects that had been founded in 1856, but was felt to be rather conservative, elitist, and based on the coast, primarily Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. So architects in Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis were interested and founded a much more progressive association of architects. And this is at a time when licensure was not, there was no such thing as architectural licensure. So being admitted to a professional association was very important indeed. Louise and Robert, as soon as the WAA was founded, they immediately applied. And Louise and Robert traveled to Chicago and met directly with Sullivan, Burnham, and Root to strategize how Louise could be admitted into the association. And they developed a strategy where Robert, for the first time, would actually rescind his application so that nobody would claim that she was riding on his coattails, and she had submitted her application alone. And this is a wonderful quote that the entire membership was asked if they were supportive of a woman becoming a member of the WAA. And when a member asked what the board thought, Burnham, who was the president of the board, stated, "We are all agreed, we are very much in favor of it." And so the member wrote, "If the lady's practicing architecture and is in good standing, there is no reason why she should not be one of us. She has done work by herself and been very successful. She's unanimously elected a member." And then immediately after that, the secretary, who was Sullivan, changed the bylaws as a gender neutral. So instead of referring to an architect member as a male, referred to as a person. So the three of them were very strong supporters of Louise. From 1881 to the time that Louise passed away in 1913, I've been able to identify 180 projects, and 30 of them are extant, most of them in Buffalo or in the region. There's a number of projects now. The first one that I think is really, really interesting was a renovation and major addition. This is the largest housing project she did, domestic project, for Horatio Brooks in Dunkirk, New York. And so she took this 1850s Italianate manor home and turned it into this Queen Anne mansion that looks very similar to some of the Peabody and Stearns mansions that you'll find in Rhode Island. She did the Kellogg residence, which is standing, in 1887 in Buffalo, New York, another Queen Anne brick building. Her favorite typology was schools, educational. She often credited that because of being the daughter of educators. But she stated that because she was the first woman architect, she did not have the luxury of specialize in any particular branch. So I, as an educational architect, am the beneficiary of her trailblazing. She did some institutional work. This was the 74th Regiment Armory on Elmwood in Buffalo, New York. This was only used as an armory for a few years, and then there was a new armory built down near Front Park. And so once the armory was moved to a larger location, this became the Elmwood Music Hall. So it is a testimony to the skills of Bethune, the two Bethunes, that they created an armory that could then had the acoustical properties enough to be a music hall. And this music hall was demolished and replaced by a Kleinahan's music hall. So very significant indeed. Bethune, her most important building certainly was the Hotel Lafayette, and that opened in 1904, and it was in a French Renaissance style. And when it opened, it was considered one of the most spectacular hotels in the country. Here's the building when it opened in 1904. And immediately upon its opening, the owners commissioned the consultants Bethune and Fuchs to design an addition. But even though they were a partnership, and with every partnership it is difficult to know who did what work, from her records I'm able to identify the fact that she was the lead designer on this project. And in fact, the addition, which is to the left in this image, was probably the last project that she worked on. And a trip to Chicago to explore hotels right around 1910, 1911 may very well have been the trip that led to her ultimate demise. There's an interior photo. This hotel sat dormant for a number of years, but in 2011 and 2012, it was beautifully restored with New York State historic tax credits, I might add, by Rocco Termini, and it was restored to its original grandeur. So here's a photo down Peacock Alley, as it was known, main corridor of the building, and this was where many of the women visitors, clients would come and sit and take their tea in the afternoons. Some of the other work that they did, commercial building, this was the Daniels building, Denton Cartier Daniels building. It was a music department store located right next to one of the Shays theaters. And this was the first reinforced steel concrete structure to be built in Western New York. And this was in 1909. Another department store, the Bricka and Enos building, which is on Main Street, and it is standing directly next to the Market Arcade. And in fact, both these buildings now they function as one building, the Market Arcade and what was the Bricka and Enos building. So you can see an image from a newspaper article on the left, the rendering, and on the right is how the building looks today. So Bethune is known for two things that she did, being the first professional woman architect, first woman admitted to the AIA, to the WAA. She was also known as the architect of the wonderful Hotel Lafayette, and she was known for something she did not do, which was she chose to not compete in the women's building at the Columbian Exposition. And there were two main reasons for it. Despite the fact that her old friends, Daniel Burnham and John Root, were leading the initiative, and they were hand selecting the architects to design the White City, the women's building was being led by a separate board called the Board of Lady Managers. And that was led primarily by a series of socialites from Chicago, one of them being a woman named Bertha Palmer. And Palmer insisted that the architect, first she insisted that the architect be a woman, that was a good thing, but then she insisted that there be a design competition for the woman architect of the building. And first of all, Bethune flatly didn't believe in competitions, neither did the AIA at the time, neither did Burnham at the time. But in addition to the fact that she had to compete, the winning fee for the architect of the woman's building would receive only $1,000 as opposed to the $10,000 of the male architects who were hand selected. So she refused on equity, pay equity, and she also refused on principle in terms of design competitions. Sadly, she spoke about it very often at the time, and she even stated that the idea of a separate women's board expresses a sense of inferiority which business women are far from feeling. Those of you who know this story, it's told in The White City, if you know that at all, but it's a really, tragic story. The woman who won the competition was just a recent graduate from MIT, and she was continually undermined by Palmer and the rest of the committee, and she just did not have the professional knowledge and confidence to battle such an experienced person, and in the middle of construction ended up walking into Daniel Burnham's office, a construction site, and had a nervous breakdown and never practiced again. So Bethune was right to sound the alarm. And of course, many newspapers at the time questioned the value of even a woman being an architect because this particular woman couldn't withstand the scrutiny of the client. And she never practiced architecture again. So it was a a very sad story, and Bethune kept that story with her until the day she died. Another great thing that Bethune did, though, was she was, as I mentioned, the first professional woman, the first woman to own a bicycle in Buffalo. And she was a founding member of the Women's Wheel and Athletic Club, which bicycling, as those of you may know, Susan B. Anthony famously stated that she thought the bicycle had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. So here's a photo of Louise on her bicycle. And I love this quote about Louise, how she goes from place to place on her bicycle, which she finds a great convenience. Mrs. Bethune is full of ideas, clever, well-read. She devotes herself almost entirely to her work, rarely going out on pleasure bent, and finds her lot a very happy and satisfactory one. She was, her bicycle that she purchased was in 1888. And the club was intact until 1896, and then they decided to fold. But they were created by professional women, physicians, principals, teachers, an architect, dentists. The first woman dentists in Buffalo were members of the bicycling club, and it was to provide respectability to the sport so that other women could also enjoy the sport. And they would go on long rides on Saturday mornings. They would start out at 6 in the morning, and they would ride from downtown Buffalo to Lockport, East Aurora, Niagara Falls. These are 20, 30-mile bike rides that they would take. So, really impressive that they did. But sadly, by 1910, 1911, she started to slow down, and she had a number of falls and illnesses in that time that left her bedridden in the last couple of years of her life. And so this was a really sad quote from a letter that she wrote to a family member saying that she'd been a hardworking professional for 35 years, but I shall only putter from now on. So this photo, I think, was taken on that last trip to Chicago that she took. And within 6 months, she was bedridden, and she never practiced again after that. And this here, I'll just close with this wonderful photo of Louise. Katie mentioned in my bio that I am working with the Trailblazing Women of Western New York. And this is a statue down at Old County Hall that we have just placed to Louise. The opening of this new park will happen in August, and we're also placing a statue to Mary Talbert, who was an early civil rights, women's rights, and anti-lynching campaigner during the Gilded Age, and Geraldine Sitta Green, a leader in the Haudenosaunee Nation and a member of the Seneca community. So we're very, very proud to continue the work of researching Louise's life and career and to present to all of you about this. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing and ask Roxanne if she has any questions.
Thank you, Kelly. And while we're waiting for everyone to put their questions in the chat, I spent this morning walking around downtown Buffalo with an old friend from Canada who's an interior designer and specializes in hotels. So, of course, the first place we went was Hotel Lafayette. She was so excited to see it. We also walked through buildings by Burnham and Sullivan, all built while Louise was practicing here. And that's one thing I have found striking about Louise's career was the era in which she worked and who her contemporaries were, including H.H. Richardson and Frank Lloyd Wright, who were all building in Buffalo at the same time. Can you tell us more about what you've maybe found in your research about her connections with any of these leading architects? Did she have any working relationships? Did she know them? Did she avoid them? What was that working atmosphere like at the time?
Sure, thank you. So Louise was the founder of the AIA Buffalo Western New York chapter. So the first thing that she did when she was admitted to the Western Association of Architects was she was placed on the membership committee, and she was charged with creating a chapter in Buffalo. And that from that, Richard Waite joined. Some of the famous architects of our era, from that era in Buffalo, E.B. Green, Edward Kent, they all became members of the chapter. And I think a lot of it had to do with Louise. So she was, I think in Buffalo, it was a very small, close-knit, a cordial group of mostly men, but architects, and they were very supportive of her. She'd said that multiple times. Now, regarding the national community, we've got evidence that she was particularly close with Burnham and John Root in particular. So Root, when she was nominated when she submitted to the AIA in 1888, John Root not only wrote a letter in support of her, but he also advocated that that she be admitted as a fellow. So the AIA did not do that. They admitted her as an associate, but Root strongly supported her in that regard. And then when they went to Chicago to meet with Burnham, Sullivan, and Root, my sense was that Burnham in particular and Root were the ones who were the masterminds behind her being admitted to the AIA, or to the WAA. And then regarding the Columbian Exposition, we have evidence that points to the fact that Root had been lobbying Bertha Palmer to hire a woman architect, and that probably would have been Louise. But sadly, he passed away. He died of an infection during that time when the architects were just joining in 1891. And when the women's building competition was in development. And after Root passed away, Palmer wasn't interested in talking with Burnham, but Burnham reached out to Louise and asked her if she would submit for the competition. So he also tried to get Louise the commission, and when he was unsuccessful, he tried to enlist her to submit in the competition. She refused. So and then the other thing I will say is that we have records that after the 74th Armory opened, the Western Association of Architects came to Buffalo to, on a trip, and many of them toured the 74th Armory Hotel, and they were very complimentary of the project. So I think it was very cordial, very warm, and she, I have not found a letter from, her and Ruth. That's been my goal. I haven't found it, but my sense is that it was a very friendly relationship.
That really is remarkable given the era and the struggles that women had in other areas of their life. And certainly the practice of architecture is not where you expect women to be welcomed. So that's really an interesting story to hear.
I will say this, sorry, that after the AIA and the WAA merged in 1889, Louise was less engaged in the profession. So I don't get the sense that, in fact, the AIA hosted its convention in Buffalo in 1901, I think, and she didn't even bother to attend.
Oh, wow.
She was still a member, but she didn't bother to attend. So it really dropped off after the merger. So my sense, she was closer to the Chicago architects, so the East Coast architects.
That's an interesting comment on the AIA, isn't it?
Yeah.
Her stand against the women's design competition at the Pan Am that you talked about, it's easy to look back on that now and interpret it as a stand for the rights of women. I really love that Susan B. Anthony quote that showed about how the bicycle was a great symbol of freedom for women. Was Louise an advocate for women within the profession and for women at large?
Right. Well, thanks for that question. So that's been something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about. Previous biographers have stated that she was agnostic, if not
Mm.
somewhat antagonistic towards women's rights. In fact, one biographer stated that she was not a feminist. So first of all, she wouldn't have known what that word was because
Yeah.
the term feminism really did not become part of our vocabulary till after Louise had passed. But when I look at the many tracks of the women's movement from that era, I would say she absolutely was. So she was a strong believer in personhood. She was a strong believer in education and co-education. So
Mm.
she was a staunch advocate. She reached out to many deans of architecture at the time, asking if they had enrolled women and if they had enrolled them in to have if they would, and she advocated that the women share the studio space with the male architects. She, of course, was an activist in terms of professional life. She spoke regularly and often to high school girls about how to become an architect and just about being a professional. And she was a staunch supporter of I won't say dress reform, but just by being an architect and appearing on construction sites and riding around on a bicycle in a dress, she was demonstrating what a woman in a dress could do. But
Yeah.
she was not, she was outspoken in many ways, but she felt, and many architects still feel that way, that she didn't have the luxury to be political. So
Mm.
I can't say that she was a suffragist. That was a political line she wasn't prepared to cross. Um, but all other aspects, all of the other tracks of the feminist movement from that era, she absolutely was engaged.
I always think of those pictures of Julia at the Hearst Castle on the construction site in her corset and long dress. And it's just, it's remarkable that women at that era, the very few that there were actually able to function on construction sites and make their way. So it's a really interesting story to hear about all of these remarkable women. What do you think Bethune's legacy is to the architectural profession? I mean, she really wasn't known for such a long time, and her mark was so important, but it kind of disappeared with
Right.
her.
Right, and it's hard to call her a trailblazer when nobody followed directly behind her, right? She really didn't blaze a trail that others followed immediately behind. And sometimes I think of it almost as a unicorn. She I, I she she was just a unique person who did an extraordinary thing, and sadly, it was forgotten about, but I feel like her story actually resonates now, maybe more than it would have then.
Yeah.
And so I feel that her legacy is now being realized by architects like you and me, not necessarily women who were her direct, um, her direct descendants.
Um, Edward, I hope I don't mess up the pronunciation of your last name. Edward Molowski in the chat said, in 1974, on my way to college by train, terminating at Central Terminal, I stayed overnight at the Lafayette Hotel before proceeding to the bus terminal on Main Street. My question was, who was the client for the Lafayette Hotel, and was being a woman an issue?
Thank you. So that's an interesting story. So the initial investors were a consortium of several business leaders from Buffalo, one of them being a man named Joseph Oakes. And he had hired Bethune. First of all, Bethune and Bethune designed his house. They also designed a factory, a coffee factory that Oakes had operated. And they were initially hired to be the consultants, Bethune and Fuchs. They did an initial rendering, and then the consortium wasn't able to raise the funding to proceed with the project. Then they hired, or they ended up merging with another financial partner from Boston, who wanted to bring in Peabody and Stern to do the work. So Bethune Fuchs was off the project for a period of time. And part of that was, we wanted a famous architect. We wanted a hotel architect. They got brought in. We actually have the renderings of what that hotel was that they designed, the rendering for it. Again, they started construction, put a hole in the ground, and then the project stalled for several years. So it wasn't until 1901 that they were able to, the partners were able to identify a financial partner, and that was the malt liquor distributor named Walter Duffy in Rochester. And you may know him because his great-grandson was Robert Duffy, previous lieutenant governor of New York State. So anyway, Duffy ended up becoming the financial partner, the backer who saved the project, and Bethune were rehired to do it. And to my understanding, there was no issue at all. And in fact, Walter Duffy commissioned a project in Rochester, and I've forgotten the name of it, but it has an uncanny resemblance to the Hotel Lafayette, but it was not designed by Bethune and Fuchs. But it was in the French Renaissance style.
Speaking of Julia Morgan, someone asked in the Q&A, by how many years did Louise's work predate Julia Morgan's work on Hearst Castle? I don't remember the dates.
Right. Well, so Louise's dates, her practicing dates were 1881 to 1913. And Morgan, Hearst Castle would have been in the 20s. And I think she graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts right around 1908 or something in that range.
Sometime around there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if Louise would have known about Julia, because Julia just would have been, by the time Louise was no longer practicing, Julia was still a very young architect. So, but she was very much in touch with other women architects from her era. Minerva Parker Nichols was one. There's about, I've calculated, there were about 25 women architects who were practicing in the 1800s in the United States. Yeah, a lot more than you think, but there was only one AIA member until Lois Howe in 1901. So Louise was the only woman architect admitted to the AIA in the 1800s, even though there were 25 women, at least 25 women architects. I'm sure there are some that I just don't know about.
That's remarkable. Because we talk now about the number of women in our profession, and how when you and I were in school, more than half of our class was female. And if you look at our class 10, 15, 20 years after we graduated, not so many of us are still in the profession. So that's been a continuing issue, having longevity in the profession, for sure.
Yep.
In any of your research, did you find anything about Louise having a favorite building? You talked about her really enjoying working on schools because of her parents being teachers. Did she have a favorite child in all of her buildings?
In her obituary, it stated that she took special pride in the Hotel Lafayette.
Is that your favorite as well?
Yeah, it's hard not to. But I quite like, I mean, that one, it stands on its own. But there are some other buildings that I think are quite lovely. I really love the Yale Grocery, which now is the Amora Cafe on Ashland and Bryant. That's a really sweet little building. But I actually don't know if she designed it. It's quite possible that Will Fuchs, her partner, did, because he lived in that neighborhood. And the original owner was German, was very, very, very well known in the German community. And oh boy, here we go. Why do females leave the profession? I did that one.
Oh boy.
Yeah, lifestyle, needing to at some point, I would say lifestyle, the long hours lack of pay, historically the lack of flexibility in the profession, especially when it comes to climbing the corporate ladder. There are many others. Rox, do you want to add a few?
Oh gosh. Well, those are kind of the primary ones. It is very difficult. It's a difficult profession to progress to the higher levels in.
Right.
And even those who are single or don't have families find it extremely difficult. It's a very competitive profession. If you're working in a large firm, it's difficult to climb that ladder. If you are self-employed, as I am, it's very hard to start and to maintain a high level of practice. And we have a lot of friends and colleagues over the years who have gone into allied fields. We have friends who've become set designers, academics. They're still somehow connected to the professions, to design, but not actually practicing architecture.
Right, and I think also the profession is it's really difficult to leave the profession and then rejoin. So
back.
once you leave, whether it's hard to take like a 5-year sabbatical, to have your children when they're young and come back like you can in education and other fields, because it's a type of profession where the knowledge is continuous and it's accumulating. So when you re-enter, you really re-enter. You don't get to come back where you left off. You have to almost start over again.
For sure.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left, so if there are any other questions, please do put them in the chat. I think we may have touched a little bit about this, but you talked about there being 25 other women who are practicing around the same time, and then it just seemed like a long period of not hearing about anybody, like decades of not hearing about anybody. In your research, was there anything that stood out to you? I mean, you've talked a bit about why Louise was kind of set up for success in a lot of ways, and she was very fortunate in that sense. Was there anything you found that showed that Louise's work or her career may have inspired other women to enter the profession?
Well, have not been able to find any women in the Buffalo area who pursued architecture after her. So that would have,
Wow.
in fact, I'm embarrassed to say this, but you know this. I'm the first first woman to be admitted to the College of Fellows since Louise. So it is. I know that again. She corresponded with Minerva Parker Nichols. Excuse me, and she was based in Philadelphia. And I know there was another architect named Sally Smith, who was a member of the Western Association of Architects with her, and she was based in Alabama. But I don't have any other knowledge of any other women that she deliberately spoke with. If she did have a connection, it probably was indirect by her advocacy to deans. So there were deans or heads of schools from Syracuse, Cornell, who were active in what became the Western New York State of Architects. The Buffalo Society of Architects ended up spreading from Buffalo to Syracuse, roughly. And so she definitely reached out to some of those heads of architecture to advocate for women to be admitted and for co-education. And so I think if there was any direct relationship, that probably would have how it would have happened. And I'm not aware of any women architects who've ever cited her as an influence.
Interesting. Is there anything else that you didn't cover in your presentation that you'd like us to know about Louise?
I guess I'll just say that learning about her has really enriched my career and my life, and I feel like I learn lessons every day on thinking about your like long-term why I pursue architecture, why it's important to me, and why I'm so glad I became an architect. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you, Roxanne, for moderating this conversation. And to add to that sentiment, Kelly, also buy the book. If you are interested in learning more, buy the book. You can get a copy on the internet. I dropped that in the chat, and you can also find a link on our website. It's always good to learn more things and to explore this history. And Kelly, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Roxanne, for joining us in this conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully you can join us for another program sometime in the future. Until then, keep reading and let us know if there's any other books that we should be putting on our list. Thank you all for joining. Have a good afternoon.